500,000, not 20, not a few dozen, 500,000 genetic markers. That is the number this investigation now turns on. That is the number that separates the suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie from every person who has ever believed that a mask and a pair of gloves were enough to make them invisible to science. 500,000 markers pulled from a crime scene in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, being mapped right now against the DNA of people who have never heard this woman's name. People who took a genetic test 3 years ago as a holiday gift and forgot about it. People who simply wanted to know where their great-grandparents were born. They do not know what they may have just handed investigators, but the investigators know. And the person who stood at an 84-year-old woman's front door at 1:47 in the morning knows too, or they should. This is not a case where the evidence is thin. This is not a case where the investigation is searching for a place to start. The biological material exists. It was collected. It is being analyzed right now. The question that every forensic expert following this case is asking is not whether the suspect left a genetic trail. The question is whether the decisions made about how to handle that trail were the right ones. Because there is a procedural fault line running through the center of this investigation. And it has nothing to do with what happened on the night of February 1st, 2026. It has everything to do with what happened afterward. In the offices of law enforcement agencies who disagreed about where the evidence should go. That disagreement may have consequences that cannot be undone. And the forensic community is not staying quiet about it. Before we examine a single data point, before we look at a single expert opinion, we have to be clear about who this investigation is actually for. Because the moment Nancy Guthrie becomes a case number, the moment she becomes a procedural argument or a forensic puzzle instead of a person, something essential gets lost and it does not come back. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She lives in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, a quiet, established residential area set against the Santa Catalina Mountains north of the city. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, anchor and co-host of the Today Show on NBC News. She has a cardiac condition serious enough to require the surgical implantation of a pacemaker. She relies on daily medication to function. As Pima County Sheriff Chris Nonos stated publicly at his February 3rd press conference, Nancy could not walk 50 yards by herself. This was not a woman who left her home voluntarily in the middle of the night. She was taken. Someone came to her home with a plan, with equipment, with preparation, and carried out that plan in the early hours of the morning while her family was asleep. On the evening of January 31st, 2026, Nancy had dinner with her family. Her son-in-law, Tommaso Offropt, had her home evening, mountain time evening. That was the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie by anyone publicly identified. What followed was not chaos. It was a sequence, a deliberate, timed, precisely executed sequence that the digital infrastructure of a modern residential neighborhood recorded in complete detail. At 1:47 in the morning on February 1st, her Nest doorbell camera was tampered with and disconnected. A T212, a separate home camera, detected motion but produced no usable footage. At 2:28, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker application disconnected from her Apple devices. At 2:36, a Ring camera at a neighbor's property roughly 2.5 miles away captured a vehicle moving at speed. And at approximately noon the same day, when Nancy failed to appear for an online church service she attended regularly without exception, she was reported missing. Her blood was confirmed on the front porch of her own home. The FBI released surveillance footage of a masked figure wearing gloves, carrying a backpack and a holstered firearm, tampering with the doorbell camera in the early hours of February 1st. That figure has not been publicly identified. Not yet. The family has been officially cleared by Sheriff Nunnos following extensive interviews and investigation. The investigation is not looking at them. It is focused entirely on something far more precise, the biological material the suspect left behind at that property. And what that material can tell a laboratory that knows how to listen to it. Before we get into the forensic science, if you want to follow cases like this one with the depth that mainstream coverage never provides, click subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we follow confirmed forensic records and documented investigative developments. No speculation is presented as fact. No theory is dressed up as evidence. New cases and updates every single week. And drop a comment right now. Do you believe the evidence in this case is in sufficient condition to produce an identification? Tell us exactly why. Now let us talk about what the suspect believed and why that belief was a fatal miscalculation. The masked figure at Nancy Guthrie's door came prepared. Gloves to eliminate fingerprints, a mask to obscure facial features, darkness as cover. They had clearly thought about the question of forensic visibility and arrived at what they believed was a workable answer. They were operating on an assumption that is no longer valid and has not been valid for some time. The assumption is this: if you have never been arrested, if you have never provided a DNA sample to law enforcement, you cannot be identified through genetic evidence at a crime scene. That assumption died in 2018. The case that killed it is one of the most significant developments in the entire history of forensic science. And it is directly relevant to what is happening in this investigation right now. Joseph James D'Angelo committed at least 13 murders and more than 50 sexual assaults across California between 1974 and 1986. For more than 3 decades, he was completely untouchable. No match existed in any law enforcement database. No viable investigative lead had survived. Every conventional tool available to investigators had been exhausted. He was living quietly in Citrus Heights, California, having retired from a career as a police officer. He believed he had gotten away with it. In 2018, investigators uploaded a forensic DNA profile generated from crime scene samples to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database that permits law enforcement access. The profile did not match D'Angelo directly. It matched a distant relative. A genealogist built a family tree around that connection. The branches narrowed. One individual emerged as the primary candidate. Investigators conducted covert surveillance. They recovered a discarded tissue from D'Angelo's residential trash. They confirmed the DNA match. He was arrested in April of 2018 and later pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder. He is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. The technology that found him is the same technology now being brought to bear on the DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. The second precedent is more recent and more structurally relevant to this specific investigation. The University of Idaho murders occurred on November 13, 2022. For college students, Kaligan Kalves, Madison Morgan, Xana Kernodle, and Then Chopin were stabbed to death in their off-campus residence in Musco, Idaho. Investigators found a leather knife sheath at the scene. DNA was recovered from that sheath. It was submitted to CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database. No match. Investigators turned to genetic genealogy. A forensic profile was generated from the sheath. A family tree was constructed around a matching relative in the accessible database. The tree pointed to a family in Pennsylvania. Investigators conducted covert surveillance of that family's residence. A cotton swab recovered from a trash receptacle outside the property confirmed the familial connection. Brian Koberger was arrested on December 30, 2022. On July 2, 2000, he pleaded guilty to all 4 counts of first-degree murder. On June 3, 2025, he was sentenced for consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary, a knife sheath, a trash can in Pennsylvania, cotton swab. That is what genetic genealogy looks like when it is applied correctly and completely. That is what is now being assembled in the investigation into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. But the word correctly matters here. And that is where this investigation has a problem that deserves direct examination. Let us walk through the forensic process precisely, because understanding how investigative genetic genealogy works is the only way to understand why the decisions made in this case carry the weight they do. When investigators process a crime scene, the first destination for any DNA sample is CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the FBI's National Genetic Database. It contains nearly 27 million DNA profiles, including more than 19 million from individuals convicted of qualifying offenses. The system is fast. Once a properly prepared sample is submitted, results can be returned in as little as 24 hours. But CODIS has one fundamental structural limitation. It is a closed loop. It only identifies individuals who have already been processed through the criminal justice system. If the suspect has never been convicted of a qualifying offense, never provided a court-ordered DNA sample, they do not exist in the database. 2 separate DNA samples from the Guthrie investigation were submitted to CODIS. 2 separate searches were conducted. 2 separate returns came back with the same result: no match. A glove recovered approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home was tested. The DNA on that glove was later traced to a local restaurant worker with no connection to the investigation. 16 pairs of gloves were recovered in the surrounding area during the search. Most were attributed to search team members. The DNA recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home, material that does not belong to her and does not belong to anyone with confirmed authorized access to the property, was tested. CODIS returned nothing. When the national database produces nothing, there is one direction the investigation can move: investigative genetic genealogy. Traditional DNA analysis, the kind used in CODIS, examines approximately 20 specific genetic markers, sufficient to confirm with near certainty whether a sample came from a specific known individual, but not enough information to construct an unknown person's identity from scratch. They are identification tools, not discovery tools. Investigative genetic genealogy operates at an entirely different order of magnitude. By analyzing upward of 500,000 markers across the complete genome, IgG generates what is called a forensic DNA profile that maps genetic connections to relatives the suspect has never met, third cousins, fourth cousins, fifth cousins, individuals who share as little as 1% of their genetic material with the suspect, people who may live in states the suspect has never visited, people who have never heard the suspect's name and have no idea they are connected to this case. The suspect believed they were forensically invisible because they had never been arrested. They failed to account for the cousin who mailed a saliva sample to a genealogy company 3 years ago as a holiday gift. They failed to account for the aunt who simply wanted to learn where her grandmother was born. Those people did not know what they were doing in the context of this case. They were making a personal choice about their own history. But that choice created a data point in an accessible database, and that data point is now being actively searched. C.C. Moore, Chief Genetic Genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, one of the leading forensic genealogy laboratories in the country, addressed the suspect directly in an interview with NBC News. Her statement was precise. She said that if she were the individual who took Nancy Guthrie, she would be extremely concerned right now. She added, according to NBC News reporting, that identification through investigative genetic genealogy is a matter of time, not a possibility, not a probability, a matter of time. But there is a problem that sits between that statement and the outcome it describes. And this is the problem the forensic community has been discussing in terms that experts themselves describe as unusually direct. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nonos confirmed publicly that the DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property is a mixture. A mixed DNA sample contains genetic material from more than one contributor. The victim's DNA is present. Potentially the suspect's DNA is present. Potentially trace material from others with lawful access to the property is also present. Family members, service workers, visitors, in a mixed sample. The ability to extract a usable forensic profile for genealogical searching depends on one critical variable: the proportion of the suspect's genetic material relative to the total mixture. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a genetic genealogist with decades of documented forensic experience, explained this directly. If the mixture contains 90% victim DNA and only 10% suspect DNA, the sample may not contain sufficient genetic material to generate a workable profile for database searching. This is not a flaw in the technology. It is a physical reality of how biological evidence behaves at crime scenes. Barbara Raventer, whose work was central to identifying the Golden State Killer, noted publicly that the sheriff's comments about challenges with the DNA in this case suggest the ratio may be unfavorable, with victim DNA representing too high a proportion relative to the suspect's contribution. But C.C. Moore addressed the mixture directly in statements to NBC News and offered a more encouraging perspective. She acknowledged that mixed samples require additional analytical steps. After the initial forensic profile is generated, bioinformatics scientists must work on the raw data file to separate and extract the suspect's individual genetic contribution from the combined blend. But she also stated that the presence of non-victim DNA in the mixture gives her reason for optimism, because it is at least consistent with the suspect having left traceable biological material at the scene. Her conclusion, stated publicly, is that if the suspect's DNA is the primary contributor in the mixture, the profile can be deconstructed and the suspect can be identified. The science has handled mixed samples before. It has produced identifications from mixed samples before. The question is whether the conditions here are favorable enough. What concerns the forensic community most deeply is not the biology itself. It is where the biological evidence was sent after CODIS returned nothing. The FBI's National Crime Laboratory at Quantico, Virginia, is the most advanced forensic analysis facility operating in the United States. It maintains what forensic experts describe as a direct and established pipeline for converting forensic DNA profiles into genealogical searches. It has processed prior cases involving this exact technology. Its protocols for handling mixed samples, maintaining chain of custody, and ensuring the results are admissible in subsequent court proceedings are the most rigorously tested in the country. The FBI formally requested that the physical evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home, including a glove and DNA samples, be transferred to Quantico for processing. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nonos declined that request. The samples were sent instead to DNA Labs International, a private laboratory based in Florida that holds a prior contractual relationship with the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The decision carried an estimated cost to the county of $200,000. The reaction from senior figures in the forensic community was, as one expert described it to reporters covering the case, uncharacteristically blunt. The concern is not whether the Florida laboratory is capable of conducting DNA analysis. The concern is whether its specific protocols for handling mixed DNA samples and its specific operational pipeline connecting forensic profiling to investigative genetic genealogy databases are equivalent to what Quantico's infrastructure provides. That equivalence has not been publicly established. There is a second concern, and this one involves an irreversible forensic reality that cannot be walked back once it occurs. Traditional forensic analysis using short tandem, repeat processing. The method used for CODA submissions physically consumes the DNA sample during extraction and analysis. The biological material is used up in the process. It cannot be recovered. If any portion of the available sample was processed using STR methodology before the decision was made to pursue investigative genetic genealogy, and if that processing consumed material before a sufficient quantity was preserved for genealogical work, the forensic opportunity may have been narrowed in a way that is permanent, not misconduct, not corruption, a procedural decision that, in the professional judgment of leading forensic scientists speaking publicly, may have reduced the window for applying the most powerful investigative tool currently available to this case. Sheriff Nonos defended the decision publicly. He explained that the Florida laboratory already held all comparative DNA markers for the case, including elimination profiles for family members and known contacts, and that splitting evidence between two laboratories would introduce inconsistency into the chain of custody. It is a coherent operational argument. It is also one that multiple former senior FBI officials, speaking publicly since the decision became known, have characterized as the wrong call in a case where both time and forensic resources are critical variables. The debate within the professional community about that decision has not quieted. Now let us look at the complete four-step process and where this investigation currently sits within it. The first step is the generation of a forensic DNA profile from the crime scene sample, not the 20-marker CODIS profile. A comprehensive genomic profile analyzing hundreds of thousands of markers across the complete genome. It requires specialized equipment and specialized expertise to produce. Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia is among the leading facilities capable of producing it. The second step is uploading that profile to genealogy databases that explicitly permit law enforcement access. The three databases currently accessible to law enforcement for investigative genetic genealogy work are GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice. Together, those three platforms contain under 2 million profiles. Ancestry DNA holds over 25 million. 23andMe holds approximately 12 million. Neither permits law enforcement access. C.C. Moore described the consequence of this gap to Newsweek if investigators could access those larger databases. She said, "Identification could be extremely rapid. This is not a failure of science. It is a failure of policy to keep pace with what the science has become capable of." This is why the FBI has made a direct public appeal in connection with this investigation. If you have taken a commercial DNA test through Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, or MyHeritage, you can download your raw genetic data and upload it voluntarily to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. Both platforms have opt-in mechanisms that make your profile available for law enforcement genealogy searches. Your data could be the single connection that links a genealogical tree to the person who took Nancy Guthrie from her home. The FBI is asking. The family is waiting. That is how you help in a concrete and direct way. The third step is genealogical research. Once a match appears in the database, genealogists construct a family tree around the matching profile using public records. Census data, obituaries, birth records, death records, social media, and genealogical archives. C.C. Moore has identified a factor that could significantly affect the speed of this step. If the suspect has deep roots in the United States and is of Northwestern European ancestry, the accessible databases have strong representation of their genetic relatives and connections can be made quickly. More stated publicly that if the person of interest has those characteristics, identification could come in minutes or hours once a usable profile reaches the database. If the suspect has more recent immigrant ancestry or family roots primarily outside the United States, the process becomes considerably slower and more difficult. Barbara Raventer noted a particularly significant dimension of this limitation when it comes to African American family trees. Genealogical research into black families frequently encounters what she describes as a documentary wall at emancipation. Around 1863, where detailed individual family records effectively ceased to exist in searchable archives. This is not a limitation of DNA technology. It is a direct consequence of historical injustice, the systematic destruction of family records during the era of slavery, manifesting today in a modern forensic context. Investigators are aware of this variable, they account for it, but it remains a genuine factor in the timeline of this case. The fourth step is confirmation. Once the family tree narrows to a candidate or small group of candidates, investigators move to covert physical evidence collection. A cup, a cigarette, a tissue, an item from a residential trash receptacle. That item is tested to confirm whether it matches the forensic profile generated from the crime scene. The protocol that confirmed D'Angelo as the Golden State Killer. The protocol that confirmed Koberger through a discarded item outside a Pennsylvania residence. The protocol now being prepared for whoever stood at Nancy Guthrie's front door at 1:47 in the morning. One additional development in this case deserves direct and careful examination, because it changes the forensic picture in a way that matters. CNN reported, citing sources with knowledge of the investigation, that the FBI possesses a photograph of the suspect at Nancy Guthrie's property from a date prior to the night of the abduction. In this image, the individual is not carrying the backpack. They are not carrying the holstered firearm visible in the doorbell footage from the night Nancy disappeared. They appear to be conducting reconnaissance of the property without the full equipment they would bring on the night of the crime. This is forensically significant in two specific ways. First, it confirms this crime was planned in advance. This was not opportunistic. This was not random. The suspect knew the property. They had been there before. They selected Nancy Guthrie deliberately, studied her home deliberately, and returned on a separate night to execute a plan they had built in advance. The behavioral profile of this crime is entirely inconsistent with any theory of impulsive or accidental criminal action. Second, every visit to a physical location deposits biological material. Skin cells transfer on contact with surfaces. Respiratory droplets settle on nearby objects. A hand on a gate. A body near a window, any moment of physical proximity to any surface leaves trace genetic material behind. The more times the suspect visited the Guthrie property, the more biological deposits they potentially left at that location across multiple separate events. This means the mixed DNA sample recovered from the property is not only a forensic challenge, it is also a forensic opportunity. It may contain the suspect's genetic signature from multiple separate deposit events. Each additional deposit by the same individual can strengthen that individual's signal within the mixture, making it easier to separate their contribution from others present in the sample. The laboratory is working with what it has, and what it has may be substantially more informative than the mixture ratio alone initially suggested. Here is where the forensic record stands as of this investigation. The DNA recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home does not match any profile in CODIS. The sample is a mixture. The suspect's genetic contribution must be separated from the victim's and from any other contributors before an investigative genetic genealogy search can proceed effectively. A glove recovered approximately 2 miles from the property was traced to a restaurant worker with no connection to the case. 16 pairs of gloves were recovered in the surrounding area. Most were attributed to search team members. The private laboratory in Florida is working on the biological evidence. The FBI has confirmed that investigative genetic genealogy options are being actively pursued. Sheriff Nonos told NBC News that investigators are definitely closer to identifying a suspect. A 5-person dedicated task force consisting of 4 detectives and 1 sergeant from the Pima County Sheriff's Department has been relocated to the FBI's Tucson field office. The investigation is not cold. It is the most active forensic case in the state of Arizona. A combined reward totaling $1.2 million remains active. But the more consequential pressure on the suspect is not financial, it is biological. It is coming from 500,000 genetic markers being mapped across a family tree that is slowly, inevitably, branch by branch, narrowing toward a name. The next critical development in this case will not be announced at a press conference. It will happen in a laboratory, likely without warning, when a genealogical match returns from a database and a name appears on a screen for the first time. That moment will initiate a surveillance protocol. Investigators will locate the candidate. They will observe. They will wait for a moment of discarded biological material. They will collect it and confirm the match. The protocol that found D'Angelo, the protocol that found Koberger, the protocol now being built for the person who stood outside Nancy Guthrie's home on the morning of February 1st, 2026. They did not account for their own genetic history. They did not account for the relatives who made personal decisions about their own DNA years before this night ever existed. They carry their own identification inside every single cell of their body, and the science is coming for them. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was taken from her home in the Catalina Foothills on the morning of February 1st, 2026. Her blood was found on the front porch of that home. Her daughter Savannah told her Today Show colleagues on March 5th that she is still standing, that she still has hope, and that she is still herself. That statement belongs at the center of every frame of this investigation. Someone who has never considered themselves part of any criminal case went home sometime in the past few years and opened a package with a genetic testing kit inside. They swabbed the inside of their cheek. They sealed the sample they mailed IT. They waited for their ancestry results. They did not know they were constructing a forensic trail. They did not know that branch of their family tree would one day become a critical data point in a search for someone who took an 84-year-old woman from her home in the dark. The laboratory is working. The family tree is being built. The person responsible believed that preparation and darkness and gloves were sufficient protection. They were not. The science does not care about the mask. The science cares about the 500,000 markers carried in every cell of every biological trace left on every surface ever touched. Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. Her family deserves answers. And the evidence, preserved and applied with the full force of what forensic science can now do, will produce those answers, branch by branch, marker by marker, one confirmed match at a time. If what we examined today gave you a clearer picture of where this investigation stands and what forensic science is now capable of, hit the like button and subscribe. We cover cases like this with the depth they demand every single week. Leave a comment with your analysis. Which element of this forensic situation do you find most significant? The DNA mixture challenge, the laboratory decision, the database access gap, or the prior visit and its implications for additional biological deposits. Your analysis matters here. And share this video with anyone who still believes the mask and the gloves were enough to make this suspect invisible. After watching this, they will need to reconsider that entirely. If you have any information related to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, contact the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI or submit online at tips.fbi.gov. The Pima County Sheriff's Department can be reached at 520-351-4900. All tips can be submitted anonymously. The Guthrie family has offered $1 million for information leading to Nancy's recovery. Combined with rewards from the FBI and Crime Stoppers, the total available exceeds $1.2 million. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old. Catalina Foothills, Tucson, Arizona, still missing, still being searched for. Bring her home.